Christopher Paolini, the youngest best-selling author ever, and the mastermind behind the Inheritance Cycle and the Fractal Verse. Mr. Paolini, thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, thanks for having me. It's an absolute pleasure.
Yes. I'm just super excited to get the chance to talk to you because I've always been really attracted to your books because you started off writing at a very young age. And just like me, I've just always been attracted to your stories and your writing. So I'm just very happy and to, get the chance to talk to you. I wanted to kick things off by asking, how old were you when you wrote Eragon? And had you written any books before writing Eragon?
I'd written a lot of stories, but no full-sized books. The longest story before Eragon was 10 pages max. Most of them were quite a bit shorter than that. Eragon was really sort of an exercise to see if I could write something that was 3, 4, 5, 600 pages long. So I was 14 when I originally thought of the basic idea for Eragon, or stumbled across it, I should say, and that idea being of a young man finding a dragon egg and having an adventure as a result. I was 15 when I actually started the world building, and then actually writing it took from 15 through to 17. And I know, and that also includes promoting it, self-publishing with my parents. And I know I was 17 when we were self-publishing. I'll always remember that because my parents had to co-sign the contract with Random House because I was still a minor when that happened.
Oh, that's really cool, actually. Yeah, that's just what I wanted to ask because at your event, because I believe last year was the 20th anniversary of Aragon. So
Of 20th anniversary of the Random House edition.
yes, the random
Yeah, the self-publishing edition came out the year before that.
Yeah. And when I went to your event in San Francisco, you mentioned that you had traveled across like parts of America to promote Aragon. So, could you talk about that? What was your experience traveling to these different schools promoting Aragon, and what was it like for you, especially at such a young age?
Pretty stressful, both on a financial standpoint, because we didn't know if the book was going to, ultimately be a success, and we put a lot of effort and time and money that we didn't have into printing it and then traveling with it. And then stressful just sort of on a personal level because it meant a lot of early mornings and a lot of public performance, which I was very much not used to since I was homeschooled my whole life, and I'm naturally more on the introverted side than the extroverted side. So it was difficult to step out in front of, classrooms and auditoriums of people my own age and just talk about the book. But I did it because I was passionate about it, and selling books meant food on the table. So the incentive was incredibly strong.
Yeah, when I was reading about that, I was actually really impressed because I myself aren't isn't I'm not really confident whenever I go in front of people and I'm talking to them, especially in big crowds. But as an author, now that I'm promoting my books and going to book signings and sometimes even going to schools just like you did, I have gotten a lot more confident. So when I read your story, I was just like, oh my god, he went through the same thing I did. But when
And the trick is just realizing that everyone wants to enjoy themselves when they go to a book signing or they're at a talk. And so if they see you appearing to enjoy yourself, even if you're terrified on the inside, even if this is the last thing you want to do, if you smile and act with confidence, people respond to that. And before you know it, it stops being so scary. There's always a little bit of jolt of adrenaline before going out in front of a crowd, and that's a good thing. But it stops being perhaps so truly scary.
Yeah, well, obviously you've had a lot of experience with it because you've been writing for so long. But I just wanted to ask because when I was reading Aragon and all the other books, I realized that they're just so long, and I believe Inheritance is almost 900 pages long. So, how did you, I know you were homeschooled, but as you grow up, how did you find the time to write all these massive books, and how long did it take you to write each one?
Well, you already touched on the answer to that, which is I was homeschooled. And I graduated from high school before I started writing seriously. I used an accredited distance learning school, so I had an actual high school diploma, but I am not able to multitask very successfully. So when I was working in high school, I really just focused on the coursework and getting through it as fast as possible. And then after that, I was able to really focus on writing. If I had gone to public school, the education may have been fine, but I just would not have had the time to write in the way I did. So it was pretty all-consuming to write Eragon. And as I said, I started in 1998, and then Random House actually released it in 2003. So that's 5 years. It was an overnight success that took 5 years of daily work. Let's see that. So Eragon was 2003 for Random House. Eldest came out, was it 2004, I want to say?
I think when you mentioned in the acknowledgement section of Eldest that you were, I believe, maybe 20, 30 years old when you published it. I'm not sure, but...
Let's see. I'm just going to look it up as we're talking. Actually, it may have been 2006, now that I think. 2005, because I remember it was right around the time of that the Eragon film was filming, and that film came out in 2006. So yeah, Eldest came out in 2005, so that's another 2 solid years of work there after the touring for Eragon. And then Brisingr was 2008, and Inheritance was 2011. And some of those took longer than they should have to write, simply because of life events. I was doing a lot of touring. Sometimes I just wasn't able to focus as well as I wanted to on the work itself. For example, with Murtagh, with the most recent book in the world, I wrote that book in 3.5 months. To be fair, there was editing and revisions that had to be done after that, but the bulk of the work only took 3.5 months. So I can work quickly when I have a good plan and I know what I'm trying to do, and I don't have to get on an airplane every 2 weeks.
Are you usually does your publisher have a deadline for you, or do you just write freely?
It depends. It depends on the book. With the original books, I had deadlines we were all shooting for, and publishers usually work on a 6-month to a 1-year lead time. So once they have committed to a deadline, or excuse me, once they have committed to a publishing date, you really need to try to hit it, because it's, very difficult for them to shift gears. There's a lot of people and a lot of money that goes into hitting those publishing deadlines. With Murtagh, for example, I knew that last year was the 20th anniversary, and I was planning on writing Murtagh, but I also wanted to have it for the 20th anniversary. So I called my editor and I said, for it to be published in 2023, when do you need the manuscript by? And she gave me a date, and I got it to her by the date. So in general, writing to deadline's not my favorite thing to do, because the books are very big, and sometimes the work can suffer if you're really having to just pull all-nighters and do things like that. But at the same time, having deadlines can help you actually finish the work, because it has to be done by X, Y, Z, and that is also helpful.
I do feel that Eragon and all the Inheritance cycle in general, the books being very long, is actually quite helpful, because the world you built in the Inheritance cycle is so rich and detailed, especially with all the languages you created. And I remember at the San Francisco event, you demonstrated the Dwarvish language. So what was it like developing the languages of the world of Allegasia, and what was the process behind that?
Well, I'm no linguist, and anyone who is a linguist will know that immediately upon looking at my work. But I do love words and language, and I love playing around with them. The ancient language, which is the main language I invented, it has very similar grammar to English, but it's the words are based very heavily on Icelandic and Old Norse, with some Germanic, Old High German thrown in there. And that provided a good basis for the sound and feel that I was going for. I wanted something that was a little harsher than a lot of Elvish that I'd seen previously in other books. Then with the Dwarvish and the Urgal languages, both of those I invented from scratch. And those were a lot of fun. I mean, honestly, inventing a language, at least in a rough shape, isn't that hard. Mechanically at least. And there are a lot of websites about constructed languages or conlangs that you can go search up. The easy way to do it would be to noodle around and just throw some random sounds and shapes on a page, pick a couple of consonant clusters you like and a couple of vowels and a couple of sounds, and then use that to extrapolate what vowels and what consonants you're going to have in your language. And at that point, you simply start creating words according to those rules that you're established right off from those experiments. The tricky bit, though, and I say tricky, and that's a huge understatement, the tricky bit is grammar. But again, you could come up with a rough grammar fairly quickly, but it can also, you could spend years on it if you want. It gets as deep as you want. But the real depth comes from the fact that all words have histories. And this is true for real words and true for invented words if you're being honest about it. And trying to figure out that history is what can take you a lifetime. I mean, it's sometimes said that Tolkien wrote Lord of the Rings in order to have a setting and a justification for his invented languages, and there's some truth to that. And at a certain point, I had to decide how much I was willing to invest in the languages that most people just kind of skim over when they read the books, versus focusing on telling the stories I wanted to tell. So the languages are not as accomplished as I would like, but the flip side is I was able to actually finish the books and tell the stories I wanted to tell.
Yeah, it reminded me a lot of Lord of the Rings because Tolkien actually created the Elvish language. So I was really impressed when you actually developed the languages for the books. In my books, I do have a language, but it's not as fleshed out, and they mostly speak English in the book.
Yeah.
But
And the fun thing with languages is if you make a mistake, you can just say it's an exception. It's like, well, it's I before E except after C, or in sounding like A as in neighbor or way. But that's also partly because English is just such a hodgepodge of different styles and languages that we can get away with that.
yeah. When you were developing the languages, did your parents just ever come in the room and hear you speaking Dwarvish and maybe think,
No, I actually paid basically zero attention to how any of it sounded. I was only concerned with how it looked on the page. It wasn't until Eldest came about, and then while I was working on Eldest, I was working on a deluxe edition of Eragon, and we did some expanded language material for Eragon, and then expanded language material for the deluxe edition of Eldest, and then I really started focusing on sounds and actually codifying the languages to a greater degree.
I see. Okay, got it. So the inheritance cycle is all fantasy, but you in the later years you also wrote the Fractal Verse, and that's sci-fi. So with Sleep in the Sea of the Stars and the other books in that series, I believe there's only two. You explored, the sci-fi genre. So how did writing science fiction compare to writing fantasy, and did your writing style or your process of thinking of the story change in any way?
I'd say that the tools used for building stories remain the same no matter what type of story you're trying to tell. And similarly, the world building that one does for fantasy is very similar to the world building one does for science fiction. The difference would be where you put your attention, and also perhaps rigor. Not all science fiction is rigorous, but quite a lot of it is scientifically rigorous. So that could be a big difference as well, even though you're still using the same basic tools to create both settings. For me, and I've talked about this before, one of the big things was getting to use a more modern vocabulary, which I really enjoyed after over a decade writing fantasy, where I was more limited in what I allowed myself to use. And I was increasingly more limited as I sort of became a better writer, became more technically accomplished. I paid more attention to whether or not a word was modern or not. But it's also difficult because you want a modern audience to understand your work. And you can go so far down the historical route that you'd need a history degree or a linguistics degree to actually read your own work. And that's kind of defeats the point of, the purpose of telling a story for a modern audience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I haven't even read to Sleep in a Sea of Stars because I was actually busy reading the entirety of the Inheritance Cycle. But one day I will eventually get to it. But either way, in your books, when I'm reading the Inheritance Cycle and when I eventually read the Fractal Verse, there's a lot of world building in your books, and you have to dive deep into these worlds. So how did you go about building the worlds of your books, and what was the most important part of that process for you?
I mean, most of it to me is just asking questions about the world that the characters in and the characters are in, and thinking about the questions that the characters themselves would ask. You know, if you're in this setting and a dragon appears, or if this type of magic is possible, then what are the questions that naturally arise? And I think ignoring those questions results in readers scratching their heads going, but what about, what about, and of course you can't answer every question, and you're not, as the author, I'm not omnipotent. I can't, actually, omniscient. That was the word I was trying to say there. I'm not omniscient. I've missed things, of course, that I should have thought about and just didn't. And that's the nature of the process. But yeah, just trying to think about what you would naturally ask about and investigate about leads to a lot of interesting world building. The big things I've learned over the years are paying attention to how you're breaking physics, whether that's with magic or technology, because that determines what's possible or not in a physical sense in your universe. So how are you breaking physics? What does that allow for, or what does that disallow for? And then you basically have free reign at that point to think about societies and religions and economics and all of languages and all of that.
Did you ever use real world religions as a groundwork for you? Because when I'm writing my books, it's set in a world where the cultures of these people, they're called the wielders. It's based on Greek mythology, but I kind of put a twist on it. So, for example, the underworld in Greek mythology is called the underrealm in my books. So did you have something similar with yours?
Nothing too specific. There's one or two things that I drew from in a very oblique fashion. The thing is that the more you learn about religions throughout history and also the modern day, the more you come to realize that no matter how outlandish a certain belief might seem, someone somewhere believed it and truly believed it and really truly were invested in this particular idea. So that's kind of freeing when you have that you can just come up with a religion that can be completely bonkers, and yet there are historical examples of things like that. In Murtagh, for example, there's I guess we could call it, there are these cultists in Murtagh, spoiler alert, and some of their behavior might seem really cartoonish or off the wall, but I've had some family members in a cult, and I can tell you from personal experience that those behaviors and beliefs are quite realistic. I mean, mind you, I didn't know anyone who was worshiping a giant dragon or anything like that, but you get the point.
I see. So I've talked about, the world building of your books and even the languages, but I also want to talk about the characters, because you have so many characters, from, dragon riding humans to immortal elves. So how do you create all these diverse characters and relatable characters across in both your fantasy books and your sci-fi books?
Boy, that's a tough question. There's so many ways to create characters. I feel like I am not qualified to give a great answer to that. You can create a character by having a physical image or characteristic or behavior in mind, and then you continue from there and try to create a fleshed out person. I think the main thing is just trying to have empathy for the person, which was hard for me when I was a teenager, and it's something I really had to work at to learn, especially when writing from one point of view. I would get so deep into that point of view that I would start to view all the characters the way my point of view character viewed them. And sometimes that ends up making me write the other characters, the side characters, in ways that just serves the main character's interests instead of how they would actually behave, if that makes sense. So I think when it comes to characters, just try to pay attention to how people believe and behave. Be sympathetic to their beliefs and behaviors, even if you don't agree with them, even if you find it abhorrent. Realize that everyone does what they think is right. And the more you think about that, the the more interesting that can get. But and then even if you're judging the character, try not to preach about it too much on page, which
Yeah.
I have done on occasion. I'll admit, but
Yeah.
yeah, I think so. That's the main thing is with characters is just allow yourself to sink into who they are, allow yourself to ask questions that they would ask, and to then be honest about the answers and the questions.
Well, I'll definitely take that advice because personally, when I was beginning to write my books, my very first books, I did have trouble coming up with these characters, and even my main character and his friends weren't that interesting. But then, as I began to write more, like another series, the characters became more interesting because they were more realistic, and I put parts of me into my characters.
Yeah.
So what I'm actually doing now is that I'm actually going back to my original series and writing second edition copies because I wanted to not only flesh out the world a little more and expand upon it, but also improve the characters because in the original editions they weren't that relatable. They were just characters going on quests, fighting dragons and all these ancient beings. But in this, I'm actually giving them a personality. That's just why I wanted to ask that. Um,
Well,
but
I think that's all good, and also I'd say that if you know what a person is scared of, if you know what makes them afraid, if you know what they fear, and if you know what makes them smile and laugh, you know an awful lot about them. Maybe not everything, but and then how do they react to their fear, and how do they pursue their happiness? Those things will tell you an awful lot about a person.
I think you should make that into a quote. That was really good.
So and then that's the thing is you could just say this person is afraid of X, this person is afraid of Y, this person is afraid of Z, and it may be a little mechanical, but people are afraid of many different things and react to them in many different ways. And the other thing I was going to say is one of the big advantages of writing a series is you get to know the characters over a long period of time, as do the readers. And I find that the characters get increasingly rich the longer I write them. And that was something I struggled with To Sleep in a Sea of Stars, the first book in the Fractal Verse, that it's a single book, and I just didn't have as much space or time or words with these characters that I had with the characters of the inheritance cycle, and I missed that.
I see. Yeah, so obviously you've been writing for a very long time, and from the inheritance cycle, the fractal verse, and you've gotten the chance to flesh out all your characters and develop them. So how do you feel, because you've been writing for so long, how do you feel your writing has developed over the years? Has there been any changes or shifts from when you were first writing your books till now with the release of Murtag?
Well, I'm a lot more technically accomplished, I think, and that just comes from years of practice and lots of editing and lots of thinking. Getting to write new things is very helpful, and I actually wish I'd have had the chance to try my hand at more stories of different types over the years. Each book is so long that I can only get so many in over the years. So the biggest changes, though, would be that I'm much more confident of achieving the results that I want to when I actually am trying to write a scene that's, scary or tense or romantic or whatever. And then having better control over the individual words and sentence lengths and all that.
I see.
Also, I'm more interested in character than I was when I started. I find that these days, although I still love physical adventure quite a bit, I'm much more interested in who the main character is and what they're feeling and what they're struggling with, and that draws me into a story much more than simply the premise of the physical adventure, which is perhaps what was more attractive to me back when I was 15.
Yeah. I also when I'm writing. I just turned 15 actually, just a month ago.
Congratulations.
Thank you. But I started writing books when I was 11, and even though I've been writing for 3 or 4 years now, I've definitely seen a change in my writing style. When I was writing like each sentence had like 3 to 6 words, and I go back to it, and I'm like, what is this?
Well,
And
you have a different brain now than you did at 11, and I can tell you from personal experience, you are going to have a different brain at 25 than you do at 15. But if you keep working at writing over the next 10 years, you may have great, you know, you may have great financial and publishing success in that time. You may not. It's impossible to predict, but you might. But the other thing is, that's 10 years of practice that someone who starts writing at 25 is never going to get. And if you put that practice in now while your brain is still developing, it rewires your brain in really interesting ways, and it makes it so that you're always going to have a faculty, a skill with the language that you wouldn't otherwise.
Yeah, I do plan on to continue writing more, not as books, but as movies.
Right.
And I kind of want to use that to transition over to my next question because Eragon was adapted into a movie back in 2006, as you mentioned, and I watched it, and I actually don't completely remember it because I believe I watched it back during the pandemic. But from what the videos I've watched and the articles I've read, not a lot of people actually liked it. So I just really wanted to ask, how did that movie even like come to be? Did you have any say in it? Did you have a big part in it, or were you kind of like Rick Riordan and the Percy Jackson movies, and you just didn't have a say?
Well, I'll tell you a behind-the-scenes tidbit, which was a lot of the people who worked on the original Percy Jackson movies worked on Eragon. It was a lot of the same. It was the same studio. It was Rick and I had a very similar experience with Eragon. As Random House was preparing Eragon for publication, it actually had a lot of behind-the-scenes buzz that I didn't know about, and the book got shopped around in Hollywood, and we heard that Fox was interested in the book, and I was on my first book tour for Random House when they made a formal offer, monetary offer for the book. And at the time, in retrospect, part of me wishes I had waited longer for someone else to step in with the book. But the other thing is, although the film is not a great adaptation, it fueled the fan base in a way that perhaps wouldn't have happened otherwise. Yeah. And in any case, my family and I were not in a financial position to be able to just walk away from that kind of money back then.
Okay.
So I don't feel bad about accepting the offer. However, I was not really involved in the process of the film. I got to have a couple calls with the screenwriter, who was a lovely gentleman by the name of Peter Bushman. His first draft was actually quite close to the book, and then through notes from the studio and other people, it ended up evolving into the form that people are now familiar with. But again, I really had no involvement with the film. They didn't reach out to me, and I really had no idea that it was actually even happening until they were just about to go into production.
Okay. Were you ever on set? Did you give
No,
any recommendations to actors?
no. I mean, they did offer to give me a cameo in the film. They were filming over in Budapest, but I was touring for Eldest at the time, and to get over to Europe and then back with everything that was going on was just going to be too physically hard.
Well, we're now actually getting a new Aragon adaptation as a
Yeah.
Disney Plus series, and I'm actually really excited for that because I felt that Disney did a really good job with the Percy Jackson show, so I'm looking forward to Aragon. So, do you have any details or updates on that? What can fans expect?
There have been quite a few things happening behind the scenes, and I wish I could talk about them, but if I do, Disney's going to come yelling at me, and you don't want to anger the mouse house, as they say. But the show is continuing to be in development. It's very exciting at the moment, and I hope to have something more to say about it in the near future.
Is there like any small details you could give? Like, have they planned out how many episodes there are going to be, or have they chosen the directors, or anything like that?
No comment. No comment.
Okay. Well, I look forward to watching the show when it eventually does come out.
Thank
Are
you.
there any more books you have planned for the world, for the Inheritance Cycle, or even the Fractal Verse?
Yes. An enormous amount of both the Fractal Verse and the World of Eragon. I just have to actually write them. This year, I was hoping to write another book this year, but I have actually had all of my time chewed up by the deluxe edition of Murtagh, which comes out October 15th. I've done quite a bit of content for that. And then I've been working on scripts this year. Scripts for Eragon, scripts for To Sleep in a Sea of Stars, a couple of side projects that I've got going as well. So I've been learning how to be a good screenwriter, and it's been a fun experience.
I wasn't aware that To Sleep in a Sea of Stars was being adapted?
Yeah, it's currently under development with a paired up production company. The first company is Made Up Stories. The other one's called Snoot Entertainment. And
Okay.
we've been going around for a little while, really getting the right form for what we think is going to be a television adaptation of To Sleep in a Sea of Stars. We just had some super exciting news on that front. But again, I can't say anything about it, which is incredibly frustrating. But again, hopefully in the near future. But that's the way it is with Hollywood. And, it's easy to run around excited and say, oh, this is happening or that is happening, but sometimes it doesn't happen or it falls through. And again, the conversations you have with other creatives and professionals in the entertainment industry, whether it's publishing or Hollywood, kind of need to be confidential unless everyone is happy to have it out in public. And that's, again, because things change, or you just say things in confidence or in private with someone and trust that it will remain private. So it's never really, these things don't really get talked about until it's actually happening. And this, everyone's on board and it's like, okay, now we can have a press release. Now we can have interviews. Now we can build everyone's excitement up. And hopefully we're getting pretty close there with Eragon.
Okay, great. Well, I'm excited for it, and I'm gonna make sure to read To Sleep in the Sea of Stars before the adaptation comes out. But that's all I have for you today. So thank you so much for joining me today. It's been amazing hearing about your journey as an author and obviously the worlds that you've created. And I'm super excited to obviously see the new Eragon show, To Sleep in a Sea of Stars, and whatever else you have planned next for the Inheritance Cycle and beyond. So thank you for joining me.
My pleasure. This was an absolute delight, and all the best with your writing. I hope to see your books on the shelf all over the world.